For those of you who have just joined, welcome. My name is Althea Middleton-Detzner, and I'm the Digital Peacebuilding Advisor with Search for Common Ground. I think we'll go ahead and get started. There's still folks that are joining, but we'll get started with a round of introductions. We're joined today by David Jay of the Center for Humane Technology and Lisa Shirk, who's the Senior Chair and a Professor at Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame. We're thrilled to have you join our session today, which will focus on conflict resilience and the collaboration between tech and peace building to build social cohesion online. So for just a brief overview of where we'll be going in today's session, we're going to start with introductions. We'll then talk a little bit about the history of technology and social cohesion, how we got to where we are today. We'll also do a round of sort of targeted questions for each of the panelists based on their kind of individual experience and expertise in this area. And then we'll close out by looking at, what's coming next and where do we think that we're headed in this space. So I'll start by just introducing myself, and then I'll pass it to the panelists. My name, again, is Althea. I'm working with Search for Common Ground as a digital peace building advisor. And just to share a little bit about myself, I am working with Search on their digital peace building programming and practice. And at Search for Common Ground, we really look at digital peace building as an opportunity to bring media technology and data tools into our peace building programming, to enhance our programming, to bring our programming up and into sort of the digital age that we're in today, as well as to develop new methods for the digital environment. So what does it mean to actually conduct peace building program in online or digital spaces? And then we also look at the drivers of conflict. So what are the ways in which there are digital drivers of conflict? What are the ways in which things like hate speech, mis and disinformation, violent extremism, polarization, gender-based violence, how are they actually being fueled by the digital environment? And then again, what are some of the responses and methods we can use to address them? We also are excited to be partnering with various technology and social media companies and working in the technology space through these partnerships and at sort of a policy and practical level through the development of what we are calling the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion. And that's how the panelists that are here today and I have been collaborating over the last 6 months or so. We're in the midst of conducting some research and hoping to launch the council later this year. And the purpose of the council is really actually to shift the conversation away from the conversation that really has been kind of dominating the news media and a lot of the engagement between the technology sector and the peace building sector. So shifting it away from looking at the digital harms and those digital drivers of conflict and how do we do content moderation, what's happening, what's not happening, and instead to focus more on what are the ways in which technology platforms and products can actually foster and support and facilitate social cohesion in society. So that's kind of the theme and the focus of the council and of our research. And the hope is that we can really focus on pilot projects that meaningfully engage these two sectors in actually building those kinds of products and platforms that can support, facilitate, and foster social cohesion. So that's a little bit about Search for Common Ground and my role there. Let me pass it first to David and then to Lisa to introduce themselves as well. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how you got to this sector.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say it's been such an honor working over this past 6 months with both of you. My name is David Jay. I'm the Chief Mobilization Officer at the Center for Humane Technology. We are a nonprofit that works to catalyze a humane future. Many of you may know us from the documentary The Social Dilemma, which built on a lot of the work that we've been doing to help to explore some of the harms of social media and of a persuasive technology that extracts human attention. Mm-hmm. And what we have found, sort of the central area of concern for us, is that as we explored some of the harms that were taking place around social media, we saw that there were ways in which our technology landscape is diminishing our capacity to deal with some of the most challenging catastrophic risks that we face, risks around the glowing climate crises, risks around structural inequity. And our mandate is really to create technology that helps people come together to address the most critical crises of our time, rather than diminishing that capacity for people to come together. And that's where peace building and the idea of social cohesion is incredibly central, not only to our work, but to the discussions that we're seeing happening around the technology sector. So as the head of mobilization, I interface directly with the technologists who share our concerns that there is something structurally wrong with the way that social media is being built, and who want to see it built differently. And whether I'm talking to people inside of major platforms, or startups who are emerging, or that some of the investors and accelerators that are funding those startups, what we're seeing is that there's a real appetite a real acknowledgement that the way that we've been bringing people together has some structural flaws, and a real appetite for insight into how to bring people together in fundamentally different ways that can create affordances for a healthy conflict that can help to support social cohesion rather than diminishing it. And that's where insight from the peace building sector, building a deeper bridge that isn't just about solving the harms, but is really about informing how innovation happens, holds immense potential. And that's why I've been so honored to be working, Lisa and Althea, with both of you.
Great, thank you. David and Althea, I really want to applaud the work that both of you are doing. The Center for Humane Technology is doing fantastic work, and the peace building community really needed someone to help us build that bridge. Because yes, we see that peace building organizations have skills and insights that are necessary for the tech companies. And at the same time, we really need the tech companies to help us figure out how do you scale the kinds of listening and dialogue that we need to be having around the world. Because peace building, when you're doing it with 10 to 20 people at a time, the harms are scaling much more quickly than the kinds of activities that most of us have been running for the last decades in the field of peace building. So yeah, I would say peace building organizations really are in dire need of figuring out how we scale our bridge building and peace building activities. To introduce myself quickly, I am Lisa Shirk. I used to work at the Alliance for Peacebuilding full-time. Now I'm only just really chairing the Technology and Peacebuilding working group there. And we have monthly meetings in which all the peacebuilding members and others, everyone's welcome to join, meet on the third Tuesday of every month to talk about new technologies that we're excited about, how we're integrating technology into peacebuilding planning, conflict assessment, all kinds of different aspects of our operations. So please join us there. And I also teach digital peacebuilding here at the University of Notre Dame in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. My other hat is with the Toda Peace Institute, where for the last 7 years I've been running a research project, which is working with partners around the world to, first of all, document the impact that social media is having on conflicts, both positive and negative, across the African, Latin American, and Asian continents, particularly because the global North has had so much more attention than the global South. So that research project has documented about 18 different countries and how social media is impacting levels of social cohesion there. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Althea for the next section.
Thanks, David and Lisa. Appreciate it. And just to kind of get the session started a little bit, get into the substance with the three of us, I'm going to just do a brief framing of what we might consider the history of this intersection of technology and peace building, social movements, and social cohesion. I'm going to start actually in the late 2000s and sort of early 2010s, when there was really a lot of enthusiasm for the role of technology and social media platforms for connecting the world, and the use of these platforms by activists for online organizing, for exposing human rights abuses, for providing a voice that democratized and provided a platform and amplification of voices that maybe otherwise didn't have that kind of venue and that ability to really speak to the world. And this was really around the time of the Arab Spring, And the concerns were really kind of limited, I would say, to some digital security concerns, maybe for activists, and also some concerns around maybe the role of maybe like authoritarian governments and regimes in tracking online activists, things like that. But for the most part, it was sort of the heyday of this intersection and the potential of technology and social media to democratize in some ways, or facilitate the democratization of places all over the world. And over time, as the platforms evolved and as the use of the platforms evolved, there began to be a little bit more skepticism about the role of technology in society. I think still there was a lot of hope for the use of tech to like document and expose and even amplify voices that hadn't been amplified. But I think new kind of concerns arose. At the time I was working in the field of nonviolent social movements, and this term of slacktivism emerged. Are we actually just moving all of our organizing online, and are we even really doing things in the offline world anymore in terms of taking action and participating in peace building or movement building? And then there was also a lot of evidence kind of emerging around the targeting and harassment of women online, the use of these platforms for bullying and harassment of groups that were already vulnerable and or marginalized in various ways. Then we kind of fast forward maybe to the mid 2000s, and this is also in the lead up to the 2016 election here in the United States, when fake news really was starting to emerge as a really big problem, or just the conversation around fake news and mis and disinformation was really kind of mainstreaming. This is also when I think some of the trust and safety teams were evolving their operations and shifting away from a focus maybe on fraudulent activity to really looking at the ways in which their platforms were being used for harm. So they started to build, these companies started to build integrity teams. They started to hire people and staff on their teams that had the kind of expertise that we have in the peace building field. Folks who come from international affairs spaces, individuals who have been working on terrorism or violent extremism, and folks like us who have experience in conflict dynamics and understanding the drivers of conflict. Then in the last 5 years or so, I think we're kind of in an era where this problem and the size of the problem in terms of how we look at online harms or the use of online platforms to drive polarization and other issues has really become quite massive. And there isn't any question about the use of these platforms or these technologies for harm. So we see the ways in which, violent extremist messages are being proliferated, or recruitment is happening online, the emergence of the dark web, all kinds of this, a lot of the same issues that we see in offline spaces are really being replicated and amplified and spread also in our online spaces. And so in turn, there really has also been a dramatic increase in terms of the response by tech and social media companies to try and address these online harms. But I think that there's also concerns that maybe the problem has become so big that companies are either in some ways possibly giving up on the whole attempt and effort, or that it's just such a massive problem that they'll just always be in firefighting mode. And so the question and the conversation around what would it actually mean to prevent some of these harms has sort of been lost in the conversation in an effort and an attempt to sort of deal with the pressing issue of just, tremendous amounts of user-generated content that needs moderation and how to go about doing so. So I'm gonna just kind of pause there. This is just, I would call it a history of this intersection, not the history of this intersection. There's plenty of things I've missed. This is a little bit through the lens of the work that I've done myself over the last 20 years. So I'd love to hear from you, Lisa and David, about what your thoughts and your take is on this history. Are there things that I've missed that you want to draw attention to, or things you would modify and change about it? And then consider kind of also reflecting on maybe two questions, one of which is a little bit provocative. I think some folks feel that today, the current environment in terms of social media and tech sector and engaging with them is sort of a lost cause. So do you see it as a lost cause? And if not, what do you see as the peace building community's role? What do you think the peace building community has to offer social media and tech companies at this juncture? And let's start with you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you for that. I think the question of the history of this field of social media is very unique, because these platforms were actually designed almost like peace technologies from the beginning. If you go back 20 years to the university, to Stanford University, and you look at the class that BJ Fogg, who was a psychology professor, was teaching, he was calling Facebook the greatest force for peace unleashed in the world. And he was predicting it was going to generate world peace in 30 years. And there was just a lot of convincing argument in his course, which was called Technology, Computers for Persuasive Technology, as sort of really helping human beings connect with each other and build empathy with each other. And he eventually had this lab for persuasive technology, which now is turned into the Lab for Peace Innovation, which some of you may know because they have come and talked at PeaceCon before about their work, which is all about innovating peace tech. So this whole conversation at Stanford, which was really the birthplace for a lot of the tech companies from Silicon Valley, is really interesting. You know, now I think we see Facebook as a dual use weapon. So just like nuclear technology had an ability to create energy and an ability to be this horrific weapon of mass destruction, the big tech platforms also now are really dual use. And so the answer to your question, Althea, is I think it's not going away. In some ways, Facebook is now a public utility. The world can barely operate without it because small businesses are on it. People use it as a platform for so many parts of their life. And I think thinking about it as a public utility is a way that we need to be moving to, because I think we're not going to be able to get to the kinds of affordances in the design of the platform that actually serve the public good and not the profiting from the ad structure, which is driving so much of the harms. So let me pass it to David at this point.
I think I would also yes and everything you shared, Althea, and just emphasize the extent to which a crisis of social cohesion has begun to really deeply shape the nature of the industry. I think much more than it has kind of admitted. But I remember the time, back in 2014, 2015, when there was still this belief that social media was going to be this primarily democratizing force in the world. And a lot of the culture inside of these companies, a lot of their hiring was built on that dream. And when that dream no longer became believable, we saw massive turnover rates happening inside of these companies. We saw their salaries have to go up a lot because in order to attract and retain people. And we saw them sort of competing to try to position themselves away from what was seen as deeply toxic conflict. So this shows when I talk to TikTok employees, they have a whole, I think, pretty thin internal story that TikTok's just a place where people have fun and it's not a place where conflict could ever happen. So they don't have those problems that Facebook and Instagram have. And so there's a way that, and I think that Facebook's name change shows that, at least among their internal staff, like social media companies kind of don't want to be social media companies anymore because the association with toxic conflict is so strong. And I think that there's a behind that a really deep need to articulate something else they can be doing. And within the tech sector, a lot of I think part of the enthusiasm for the metaverse and part of the enthusiasm for sort of Web3 and the blockchain is this desire to get back to the place where there's a hopeful future that we're building together and away from the kind of troublesome present that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit just into kind of hearing from each of you about, from each of us, I'll get us started too about just some of the experiences we've had in the particular kind of areas in which we may kind of emphasize where there is potential and hope and where some of the bright spots are. So I'm just going to kick us off by offering a little bit of my reflections and experience with cross-sector partnerships and cross-functional collaboration. Before joining Search for Common Ground, I spent 5 years at the PeaceTech Lab, first as the director of the Peacebuilding Engineers program, and later director of the hate speech program, in which I collaborated with technology and social media companies on a regular basis in developing hate speech lexicons to try and support some of the work that they were doing. And I'll start first with the Peacebuilding Engineers program, which I think does continue to have a tremendous amount of power and support and kind of inspiration for young engineers. The program itself, which was a partnership with the College of Engineering at Drexel University, was envisioned sort of in this way that was looking at the future of engineers and saying, engineers need to have social skills and need to have, more global knowledge, right? Like the engineers of today and the engineers of tomorrow really need to be able to operate in global and sort of, cross-cultural environments. And when you look at the kind of curriculum across engineering skills in the United States and globally, the curriculum is really limited to math and science requirements and very limited in terms of its exposure. So there's no geography or sociology or anthropology or social science courses that are really incorporated into the curriculum. And so we used peace building and peace engineering as sort of an avenue and an opening to teach peace building skills specifically, but also to just open up kind of the awareness of what it means, because most engineers are actually trained not to take those kind of social sector considerations into account when designing across all of the sort of sub-disciplines of engineering, not just in technology and product development. And the thing that was so interesting and so wonderful about the program is that the sort of theory of the case was driven by young engineers and their desire to do engineering in a way that did contribute to social good. And there's absolutely sort of an overarching sense that engineering is for the social and public good, and yet at the same time, this really strong kind of division between understanding the social implications of their work. And so this was a really interesting effort to sort of bridge from both a curriculum perspective. We ended up developing a series of courses in peace engineering and even a master's degree in peace engineering that Drexel University is continuing to run, and then a broader collaboration between other engineering schools that are looking at the intersection of engineering with other social sectors. So there's kind of humanitarian engineering and other, there's public technology kind of programming that's coming about, and trying to build sort of a movement around kind of engineering and technology related disciplines to start to bridge and bring into the curriculum this understanding of the need to bring kind of this social understanding into decision making and into prioritizing when making decisions about various engineering developments. We handed that program over to Drexel University and they continue to run it today. And I shifted over to a project that was a program that was already in place focused on hate speech. And we had sort of this really interesting product called the hate speech lexicons that we were developing at a country level from many different contexts. And what was so interesting about the hate speech lexicons, these are participatory driven, like very bottom up research processes that are done by partner organizations in the countries that we were working in. And the process of identifying hate speech. So just to back up for 1 second, hate speech is something that is incredibly difficult to agree on in terms of the definition. It's highly nuanced, highly coded language. So you wouldn't necessarily know all the hate speech terms in one place or another place unless you live in that environment, speak those languages. And so this is a really big challenge for tech companies when they're looking at content moderation. But what was so interesting about developing those lexicons is that they're not only a process from a peace building perspective that actually kind of, builds cohesion in its own way and can be used for offline programming to do, hate speech sensitization and bridge building in communities. It was also a product that could be used by tech companies to better understand the language environment in these contexts and to feed into some of the processes that they were doing. And the overarching kind of theme of this partnership with some of those companies was around the sort of deep insights around conflict dynamics and social interactions that the peace building community could offer to the tech sector. So this is one of the bright spots that I think that we can continue to build on and lean into, that really cannot be done kind of at scale within tech companies at this stage. I also wanted to just kind of highlight, this is not necessarily across like sector collaboration in terms of the companies, but it is a cross-functional partnership. We were doing a project that involved collaborating with data scientists as well around developing algorithms that did predictive analytics of violence on the ground. And so we partnered with a data scientist and his team of engineers to develop this algorithm, which did predictions of violence that were close to 85% accurate on a weekly basis. And we kind of matched our online monitoring of hate speech with these violence predictions to look at the relationship between online speech and offline violence. And what was really some of the interesting insights that we got is that actually these are bi-directional relationships. So there are events on the ground that can actually spike increases or increases of hate speech online, or spike certain use of certain words or certain terms or certain conversations. And additionally, you can see also that an increase or spike in hate speech online can be correlated with offline events of violence and conflict. And while these are not causal relationships, they are just correlations, they started to kind of demonstrate some of the doubts that were out there about the impact of these conversations online, about the harm that maybe online hate speech can cause. And this research was done, again, in partnership with local partners and a data scientist. And just one of the things I wanted to pull out of this example is that, one of the challenges of some of these cross-sector and cross-functional partnerships is how much do data scientists and engineers need to know about the peace building field and the work that we do, and how much do peace builders need to understand about the expertise of data scientists and engineers in order to do this collaboration. So a lot of times at the council right now, as we're developing kind of the concept and what it will look like to do these kinds of partnerships and projects, we're really asking ourselves, like, where do we meet on this bridge, and how much is enough to have these really meaningful and impactful relationships? And so I think there's a lot of examples out there. This is just one where, there are folks out there who can serve as sort of translators between these two fields, and that maybe what we really need to encourage is more translation, which sort of circles back to the Peace Building Engineers program and this idea that even just by sort of, in very small but meaningful ways, bringing in these other cross-sector kind of curriculum opportunities for young engineers, that they can actually understand how to take these what are now seen as externalities and internalize them into some of the engineering processes and into the development of products and platforms. So I'm just going to pause there and kind of turn it over. I'm going to go first to David. And David, I know, some people do kind of paint this lost cause picture as far as the role, where technology and social media companies are at. Should we just toss them out and kind of move on to the next stage? But you've often said that actually the tech sector is already changing, and that peace builders really can be a part of that change. So tell us a little bit more about your perspective on this, and what does it mean to build a movement for humane technology? What do you see as the role that this movement plays?
Definitely. And I think I want to paint kind of three actors in the sector and how I think they're ready to move. So if we're talking about this bridge, what does the technologist side of the bridge look like? How is it beginning to reach out towards peace building, looking for insight? And I'll start by talking about the inside of platforms. So and in many ways, the story of the disenchantment that you referred to, Althea, about exactly what their impact was going to be. So platforms over the past 5-6 years have been investing, large social media platforms have been investing heavily in what are called integrity teams or trust and safety teams. These are kind of the firefighters. These are the people who, as problems pop up, usually in the headlines, in ways that put pressure on senior leadership, these are the teams that have to figure out what to do about them. And these functions have become incredibly, incredibly important as the existence of these companies has become more and more defined by the catastrophic problems that have unfolding on their platforms. And as this job function of trust and safety or integrity engineering becomes richer, that's also a place where many peace builders have been invited in to say, hey, we have this big fire, we have this big conflict going on, can you help us to address it? As those teams have become more and more critical, the thinking has begun to shift to say, to extend the metaphor a little bit from just thinking about firefighting to thinking about fire inspection. How do we have people who are going around to all of the people building new products and advising them so that the products they're building are less likely to cause structural harm? And these are teams that are sometimes called responsible innovation. They're kind of like internal consultancies, and they go around and they do just that. They talk to product teams to help them understand what risks their products might be introducing, to understand how they can be built better. And what those teams are starting to realize is that they can do more than just risk mitigation. They can help people understand how to build products that are genuinely better experiences by leaning into understanding some of the risks that they want to face. And those teams, the trust and safety teams, but especially the folks in responsible innovation and the product managers who are really passionate about this, are the ones who, when we approach them and say, hey, there's this decades-long sector of peace building, they understand how to measure things like social cohesion. They have extensive experience with different kinds of interventions that can help to create a framework for not eliminating conflict, but ensuring that helping create conflict that's healthy, that builds trust rather than undermining trust. That is can be revelatory for some of these folks thinking about how to make cultural changes internally. So those are the platforms. Now, because platforms have had to invest in this, there's another stage which I'll call sort of disruptive emerging platforms. These are the people who aren't the infrastructure we have now. They're the infrastructure that we're going to have tomorrow. So, I think about the moment when, in kind of the early pandemic, Clubhouse was blowing up in a huge way, and becoming this sort of debatably becoming one of these new platforms that's going to be defining the world. And I went onto their website right as they were blowing up because I was curious. They had one job listed, which was for head of trust and safety, because they weren't ready for the potential harms that could come up on their platform. And what I immediately went to was, 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, if they were blowing up, their investors would have called them up and said, you need to hire more growth people. You need to hire more people to get as big as quickly as possible. Instead, the investors were calling them up and saying, you need to hire trust and safety. You need to very quickly, before your infrastructure is locked into place, build affordances in it to prevent the really toxic conflict that could take you down as a company. So that is becoming a central concern for these companies that are in the process of emerging. I see someone in the chat mentioned VR. When we look at blockchain, I don't necessarily think those will be the things that define the future. I think those are the center of hype right now. But things that are, we are in a place where one way or another, the landscape of technology is defined by social media. Social media will probably still exist, but it won't define the landscape in 5 years and 10 years the way that it does now. Something new is going to emerge, and we are laying the groundwork and the rules for that thing now. And the people who are laying that groundwork and laying that rules are concerned about conflict and social cohesion in a way that they were not 5 years ago, because they've learned the lessons of the large platforms. And then the last group I want to talk about are the emerging startups who really sit at this intersection. So someone who unfortunately couldn't join us for the panel today, but who I deeply respect, is Lisa Kahn. Lisa Kahn used to be inside of what was then Facebook, what is now Meta, doing extensive research on peace building and social media. And she left and founded a platform called GatherRound that was really an application of peace building principles in digital space. I've used it many times. It's a platform that really allows people to engage in structured small group conversation in ways that build shared understanding and trust. And I think she is one of a category of entrepreneurs that I interact with on a regular basis at the Center of Humane Technology, who really are eager to take insight from places like Peacebuilding and do deep innovative work to understand how you translate it to digital space, And the hopeful future, to get back to your question of whether this is a lost cause, the hopeful future that I see is that the platforms, the platforms may not be able to fix themselves in time, but as they scramble to do as much as they can, they're sending a signal to everyone else that this is a top order concern. And they are creating room for these new innovative technology companies that really want to learn from sectors like peacebuilding to create some powerful examples of what it looks like to do that and why it's powerful to do that, so that as this new generation of technology that's going to be the next round of infrastructure that defines our world comes into being, one of their top order concerns is going to be to learn from peace builders, to learn from people who are building peace building technology, and to bake that into the DNA of the things they're building in a way that was not true when the current generation of social media platforms came online. So that is my tentative narrative of hope. And I think with that, I will pass it to you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you. I think I want to emphasize that we also need to look beyond Silicon Valley. So I went to university in Canada, University of Waterloo, where the BlackBerry device was made, and it's a big town that's a tech innovation. In fact, it's called Silicon Valley North by many people, and it has a huge peace and conflict studies peace building community. So the kinds of interchanges that have been happening in Waterloo, Ontario, between tech companies and the peace building community have a much longer history in a sense. And what is so interesting is how they are doing sort of the peace engineering, peace education in a more systematized way than I think is happening in Silicon Valley. The first time I went out to Silicon, I kept saying, I'm from the field of peace building. I'm trying to build this bridge. And any other capital city or big city in the world that I go to and I talk about peace building, people know what I'm talking about. They know the UN has a peace building infrastructure and that this has been global. This is a global concept now. But I found people who'd never heard the term before, in senior positions at tech companies when I went out there in 2018, 2019. So it's a bit of a peace building desert. So it may be the community the city that's most behind. I think some of the other regions of the world are actually more exciting in terms of the development of peace tech and how to build the bridge. So in Kenya, where I was living in 2002 and 2003, the founders of Ushahidi, which is now this global peace tech company that is creating very easy to use, simple tools that help support humanitarian development and peace building actions. Ushahidi's used around the world. It was developed in Kenya by the tech sector. Now in Nigeria, they have a huge tech sector. There's a huge peace building community in various parts of Nigeria that's linking with them. The same can be said of Bangladesh and India, where the peace building community and the tech community are actually in contact with each other far more often than they are in Silicon Valley. So the Americans are behind the show in this one. I think our tech companies are the ones who are most influential. So for this reason, Althea and I, as we're interviewing all these tech company executives and leaders and engineers, it's important to map our own space in the United States to figure out how we build this bridge here. And I think we can take most of our inspiration from what's been happening across Africa and Asia, where and also in Canada, where this history is a bit older.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for those examples, Lisa and David. I think we're going to shift into a little bit more of just kind of thinking through what are some of the opportunities moving forward. So, some people say as we kind of reflect on the history, we see all the shifts over time of how we understood and how the space has kind of evolved. And, some people say that, here we are moving into a new era. Of course, all the hype and the buzzword around the term Metaverse, with Facebook's changing its name to Meta. And while we may already be kind of sick of hearing about this, I think, that we see from our from looking backwards, that we know that these spaces are changing, that the platforms will continue to evolve, and that our technologies will also continue to evolve. So I think the question really is, what does this mean for the future? Maybe not of tech and social cohesion, but really tech for social cohesion, which is, the hope that we have as we're looking at some of the new companies that are coming out that you were speaking to, David, and potentially the work of the council as well, in terms of both fostering those new startups, but also fostering collaborations that might kind of help steer us in the right direction. So let's start with you, David. You talk a lot about building, conflict resilient products and platforms. So tell us a little bit about what you think conflict resilient products look like. I know you touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about where humane tech is going.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And I will, without getting into the full definition of humane technology, I think conflict resilience is a really critical part of it. Technology that builds a sense of shared understanding while respecting human minds and human vulnerability. And one thing I think about a lot, and I think about this in the context of the technology we have, I think about it in the context of the emerging technologies we're looking at, is that when I look at the landscape of online community that exists today, it's one that is heavily pruned by toxic conflict. When someone, whether they're creating a Facebook group or a Discord server, when often you have a kind of unpaid moderator or group lead who starts bringing some people together. As they bring those people together, conflict inevitably happens, and there are no affordances to help that person or that community manage that conflict. There's very, very few affordances. And so either, and this is what happens most of the time, the person who founded the community gets burned out and leaves and the community fails, or they invest an extraordinary amount of resources and skill that they just happen to be able to bring to the table to having conflict happen well, or the community becomes toxic and stays toxic. And learns to thrive on toxic conflict. And so the communities that we have now, if I think about it as this ecosystem, the communities we have now are really a tiny percentage of the communities that are possible if we were to understand how to support these communities in moving through conflict in a healthy way. And a product which understands how to do that can be a site for community that I think many people are really desperate for. And when I looked at Mark Zuckerberg's sort of meta video, one of the subtext, a piece of subtext I saw in that was like, imagine a place where we're all getting along and where toxic conflict isn't happening. And let's imagine that this sort of like computer that sits on our nose is going to be the thing that does that. And I think that there is a really deep desire to unlock a place where those communities happen. And I think there's a strong case to be made that wisdom from the peace building sector is a really critical piece of how the technology sector does that.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And Lisa, I know you've talked a little bit about too, just kind of like what does it actually mean to design for social cohesion, and how do you see peace builders kind of being involved from the start in terms of supporting designing for social cohesion? I think you're on mute, Lisa.
Thanks. Like you, Althea, I'm in conversation with the engineering schools about what that kind of curriculum looks like. Your program at Drexel is the standard now. It's the gold standard for peace engineering. So I think there's a lot of other places in the country, in the world, that can follow that curriculum. I have examples of peacetech, but I'm thinking that, is this the time when I should share those, Althea? I have a couple slides.
Yeah, bring those out. Actually, I think,
okay.
Yeah, I think we missed them earlier. So let's do that now. That would be
great. Wasn't sure if I had missed my opportunity.
No problem. Yeah.
So I just want to give a brief conceptual framework. I'm sorry for those of you who are not into conceptual frameworks, but like we discussed among the group that is forming this Council on Technology and Social Cohesion a long time about our name and what the best name is for public trust, social trust. And, there's other terms that we use a lot in the field of peace building, which are human security and social justice. we're kind of using social cohesion as an umbrella term, but in terms of something like the hate speech lexicon, which is mapping and really doing conflict analysis in some sense, that is often labeled as a human security thing, something that you want to do to prevent actual attacks on people. And social justice, of course, is about shifting power and the movement building and promoting human dignity. So we're trying to figure out ways of being able to talk about this with a kind of a big umbrella to tech companies with terms that they might have heard before. So the functions of peace tech, you know, I'm trying to write this book right now on digital peace building and peace tech, kind of like an encyclopedia of all the different kinds of peace tech that's out there to build horizontal social trust, the vertical public trust, to do kind of peace education, to have engaged citizens who are willing to and able to have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. Then there's sort of the conflict analysis, violence prevention, the digital diplomacy for inclusive peace processes that in Geneva, they're doing a lot of work on how to use technology to get people's input onto a negotiation process. And then, of course, in social justice, we hear about this a lot, you know, with the George Floyd video mobilizing really the Black Lives Matter movement and the hashtag being a very critical part of that sort of hashtag activism to enable people to speak as one voice and be part of a movement. So there's like different elements here, and I'm not going to talk a lot about those. I want to emphasize particularly a couple of pieces of technology that people in the audience might want to look into. So in terms of the horizontal social trust, Chasm is a new tech platform designed for meaningful dialogue that many peace builders are using to promote this sort of improved affordances, which means like the details of how the platform works that enable more meaningful conversations with each other. So we had a whole session on this at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Digital Peacebuilding Community of Practice, and you can watch the video if you go to the Alliance for Peacebuilding website. There's a whole video on how Chasm works. The peace tech that I'm most excited about is called Polis, which I'll tell you about in a minute. I also want to mention Cyber Guardians, which is a Search for Common Ground program, which is working with youth and really focused on youth agency in digital peace building. So it's kind of it's a program that uses technology and teaches technology to youth in terms of how would you use Facebook and Twitter for peace building. But briefly, I want to tell you about Polis. And this has a lot of text. I'm sorry, I'm just going to kind of walk through it. Though some of you want to download this, I can send you the PDF that has this table. But I'm just going to quickly go through this. Whereas Facebook and Twitter, big platforms, the goal is to capture user attention, to collect private data and show people ads. So the goal is profit. Whereas Polis is an open source piece of technology with the goal of improving democracy. So it's not monetized for profit. It's really made to how can we help people have better conversations and make decisions. And so this idea of a platform that is actually built so you can see where there's common ground and where consensus is forming in the conversation. It's an incredible tool as a facilitator. When I first started reading about it, it was like life-changing almost to see what this technology could do. In Facebook and Twitter, the algorithms show users the posts and comments which are most divisive, because that's what keeps people's attention the longer, and that attention is what's necessary for profit. So Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Technology calls it the race to the bottom of the brainstem, which is really the worst aspects of our human nature coming out in those platforms. Whereas Polis is designed to find common ground, to heal divisions, and to foster citizen engagement. And what's so remarkable is that even in very polarized issues, it's been used all over Taiwan many times, dozens of times. The government of Taiwan has used it. 80% of the time it's led to actual legislation, because it's so evident that the citizenry that started out polarized on very different sides of an issue were able to figure out where's the common ground, what is actionable in terms of policy that we can actually implement. And, political leaders in so much of the traditional Facebook and Twitter, actually the European Union made a statement about how Facebook was altering the politics in Europe, because the algorithms, unless the leaders were saying something really kind of extremist in nature, they weren't getting onto the algorithm. So, it was forcing political leaders to become more polarizing, where in Polis, political leaders can use it to figure out how to build bigger bases, because they find out where the common ground is, and they're able to come up with points of view that appeal to more people. And so just quickly, it looks like, this is the Taiwanese version, where it's hard to explain quickly, but as a user, you're allowed to add a comment about an issue, and then people vote up or vote down. There's no responding to an individual user, but you get to see sort of where there is consensus on ideas that are being posted there. So I'll stop that. If you want the one pager that sort of goes over all those, that sort of overview of PeaceTech, feel free to send me an email afterwards and I can send it to you.
This is great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for going through those examples. And I think what we're hearing then from you, David, is kind of the ways in which the tech sector and the tech industry is learning about the need for and the desire to build in social cohesion and sort of peace building principles into its technology. And then also from you, Lisa, ways in which maybe the peace building sector and or government relations kind of spaces are using peace tech to actually engage in productive digital peace building, or engage using technology to actually foster social cohesion from that direction. So either adopting or adapting existing tech, or using tech for these purposes, and then also designing for it. So I see this is sort of kind of building that picture of where we're meeting on the bridge from both sides as well, and where some of these sort of bright spots are continuing to emerge as we move forward. I think one thing that we didn't talk too much about on the panel yet, and we'll move into Q&A in just a few minutes, but I just wanted to note, I think one of the things we didn't talk too much about today was just this idea of conflict. And I think, a lot of times people say that the online spaces are really just a replication of our offline spaces as well. And of course, there are differences in that environment. But, we're not surprised to see sort of conflict or digital drivers of conflict emerge in online and in digital spaces. And one of the things that I think the peace building community really has to offer in terms of this conversation is that it's not conflict really that's the problem. And actually, engineers grasp this quite well as well, because, they don't see the tools themselves as being the problem, rather the use of the tools. And so I think there's kind of an interesting conversation to be had there. And what I was just going to say is that, one of the things that the peace building field I think has to offer is really that it's not conflict that's the problem, it's just how we actually engage in that conflict. And so I think what we're talking about is sort of from the tech perspective, what are the affordances or the tech design kind of principles or approaches or design features that are really going to kind of support sort of a positive or productive or skillful, healthy engagement in conflict. And then from the peace building side, we focus a lot on kind of building the skills and knowledge needed in order for individuals and groups and societies to also be able to kind of engage in this healthy and skillful kind of conflict. So I just kind of wanted to mention two initiatives that I'm excited about in the year to come. One of which I think is one of the hopes of what the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion can create, which is really quantifying the measurement of social cohesion. I think this will be a really valuable contribution to translating some of our peace building concepts for the tech sector. So, just as a hypothesis, for example, are there benchmarks that we can actually aim for in terms of social cohesion that we can measure through these products and platforms? What would it look like to actually create scorecards for companies, maybe in the same way that we have done for sort of human rights assessments, so that we can kind of evaluate evaluate and compare and actually track improvement over time in terms of the ways that these spaces are actually facilitating and fostering social cohesion. And then I think on the peace building side too, what does it mean to translate and kind of adapt our peace building skills and knowledge for the digital environment? So this is a project I'm really excited about for the year to come at Search for Common Ground, where we will be adapting our common ground approach for the digital environment. And the example I keep using in some of the conversations around that is, active listening is sort of a cornerstone skill for peace builders. And of course, we often teach it in offline environments, face-to-face, or in kind of this kind of video conferencing space where you can see me nodding. I can reflect back to you what I've heard you say, check to see if I'm understanding, these kinds of things. But what does it mean to adapt active listening to an asynchronous digital environment like a Facebook feed or a comment section somewhere or a WhatsApp feed or a group, where we don't have back and forth kind of feedback like that. We don't have a visual element. We just have only the text-based information that we're seeing. And so I think that, again, on that side, we're really wanting to think about what does it mean to build and develop our skills and knowledge and to share that at scale, so that we actually have those skills, because these spaces are new, relatively new for all of us. So those are just two things I wanted to highlight, and we're going to shift into the Q&A portion for the next half an hour or so. I do see one question is teed up from Will Ferrogiaro, and just to say for everybody that if you do want to come, sorry, I think I was breaking up for a second. If you do want to come off of mute and ask your question live, all you need to do is raise your hand. I'm not sure where the raise hand function is, but maybe somebody can help me by dropping that in the chat because we have a moderator view. But if you raise your hand, we can call on you and we will unmute you and bring you into the conversation. So feel free to raise your hand at this time and or to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll continue the conversation here with you. And so I think just taking, Will, your question, and if you want to, we can bring you in live. I'm just going to read it for now. Perhaps you'll get to this, but one challenge in the bridging and engagement between these sectors is size and influence of peace builders relative to the platforms. Many of us have undertaken research, provided advice or inputs, or undertaken programs with companies. Yet, while we may learn things from them, they are frequently unsustainable or limited in terms of their impact on the company's culture and operations. Would welcome your thoughts on this in considering bridges and partnerships. And I'll just kind of get us started and then open it up to you, Lisa and David. I totally agree, Will, and we've actually collaborated on a number of different projects together. So I know we've faced these concerns and these challenges as well. And I do think that the asymmetry in terms of sort of the power dynamics between the fields is an issue of concern or a challenge that needs to be overcome in many ways. I think one of the issues that comes up a lot in the research that we have is sort of an asymmetry of access to information, to the data that is, that will help inform maybe peace building organizations to address some of the issues that we believe are coming, from the platforms. But I think that one of the goals of the council really is to spend some time building trust between these two sectors, which is, of course, a principle that we bring from the peace building field, and the importance of building trust to be able to have actually more even kind of relationships and these kind of meaningful partnerships that we're envisioning. And so I think it will take time, but I think through both the research process that we're engaged in now and, really kind of starting with a small group of like-minded individuals who really kind of are trying to meet on that bridge, hopefully we can continue to build out through small pilot projects that might actually kind of gain some traction. And I think, one of the things that we've also thought and talked a lot about is what does it mean to kind of frame the value of peace building for the tech sector? So we talk a lot about kind of just the language differentials as well. Like we really are speaking two different languages. And so I think this gets back to kind of where do we meet on the bridge, but what does it mean to actually frame some of our work in terms of a value proposition to the tech industry? Not because it needs to have a profit motive or component behind it, but more so that we can start to speak the same language. And I think on the peace building side, side, there really is a dearth of information about all the things that have been tried within the tech companies that relate to building social cohesion and that relate to in making investments in new languages and in programs that really can kind of address some of these issues at scale. And so our hope, I think, is that the research that we're doing to document some of the history of what has been tried will help to also inform not only the peace building community in terms of what's being tried, but also help to inform a little bit of that roadmap so that we can kind of build that common ground and that kind of shared zone of interest. I think the other way that I would frame that question is just to say, what problems do we think that we're actually solving for the tech companies? Because there are, plenty of folks inside who really do now understand, I think, our sector and are working pretty hard to try and bring those principles into some of the design. But it's a massive, these are some really massive companies and the problem itself is quite large. But that's a pretty inadequate answer in terms of, addressing some of the massive asymmetry. So I'd love to hear from each of you, David and Lisa, either one, if you want to jump into kind of, where you've seen some of this balancing come into effect.
Go ahead, David.
Sure. Fantastic question. And I think that I've also seen a lot of the sort of back and forth research, and a lot of it has in some ways they've been effective. A lot of it has felt targeted at policy teams, at the people who are defining what internal policies are that around things like content enforcement. And those can be a powerful way to make change, but I've also found they can kind of be a shield to keep these discussions away from product teams and away from the people who are actually defining what the software looks like and deciding what KPIs that software is optimizing for. And the much more promising, this is part of why I mentioned responsible innovation teams, the much more promising avenue that I'm seeing happen more and more is that the people who are directly involved in product decisions are at the table. And they're coming to the table with a set of concerns that they're holding and with the sort of language and terminology that they're dealing with. And they're looking for examples like the ones you were giving, Lisa, of people who have places where peace building has been applied in product development in ways that are inspirational, and they're understanding how to integrate that into their work. The metaphor that comes to mind for me, and this is an imperfect one, is the way that accessibility is talked about, where anyone who's on a product team knows that accessibility is a thing they should be talking about. There's probably one person on the team who may or may not be the one in charge of it, who's a really strong advocate, who's saying we need to be concerned about accessibility. Here's where we look for best practices. Here's the specific concerns that come up given the kind of product we're building and the experts we should be engaging with to understand those concerns. And I can see a culture of product development developing around social cohesion that is parallel to that, where anyone building a product where conflict might be playing out knows to ask questions about how to have affordances to make that conflict healthy, knows where to look for best practices, and knows where to come to peace builders to understand the specific nuances of their product surface area.
I don't know if I have too much to add to this, although I see the next question has to do with the funding available. And I think this is actually the big challenge. So I would agree with both David and Althea in terms of some of the challenges that they noted. Prominent researchers over the last year have openly stated to Wall Street Journal and other news outlets that they are not going to try to do research with Facebook or Twitter anymore because they have wasted, in their opinion, so much time trying to form partnerships where these companies promise to give them data, which were actually going to inform sort of social cohesion oriented experiments. And, it kind of all has fallen apart. So it's as if in their view, I think one of them even said from MIT, they told us they were going to give us the data and it ended up just being, a rabbit hole that we went down for months and months and months trying to negotiate this. So there are a lot of dangers and red flags in trying to form these partnerships from the outside. Because of the power, because of, yes, the funding piece, which many NGOs are getting funding from Facebook, which is good. And in many ways, the companies, they have billions of dollars and they should be paying for the research. how that influences our research and our experiments, that's the internal question perhaps for next year's PeaceCon, is like, how much do we self-censor then? If we are in partnership and are getting funding from the companies, are more hesitant to offer a strong critique of some of the policies? Or most often when I'm talking to people, it's that, yeah, it's great that they gave us 100,000. That's a drop in their bucket, they give these tiny little amounts, which help us a great deal in doing experiments and research on how to use peacetech. But often, it's just one person at Facebook who's in charge of these huge mandate of, finding local partner organizations. Like they're vastly under funding this kind of research, given how much money they're making. So the lack of proportional resources to the scale of the problem is a big deal.
Thanks, Lisa. And David, do you have anything to add on the funding side of things? Where do you think the funding should be coming from for this sort of peaceful tech sector?
I don't have too much insight there, except to say that I think that there is a real opportunity to make a stronger case for social cohesion to the investment world, both the traditional world of VCs and some of the non-traditional tech investments that I think are frankly potentially better aligned with the goals of our work. I think about folks like Seepers Unite, who are bringing together some of these alternative funding mechanisms. And though I have mixed feelings about them, to the blockchain space, where there's a lot of funding happening of new initiatives, a lot of them about communities, a lot of them not necessarily that smart about the way that conflict plays out. But I think aligning not only the funding from the large platforms, but funding from the people who are investing in innovation and new products, to understand the power of this and understand the case for building technology that really has expertise around social cohesion and peace building built into it. I think there's a rich opportunity there.
Yeah, and I might just add too, because I completely agree with you, Lisa, that the funding relationship can become quite problematic in the sense of how kind of peace building organizations are able to engage with Facebook, because Facebook becomes a funder themselves. And so, the work that they do is sort of filtered through this. How do we support the platform? And, I think that in the past too, there's been, just concern about kind of the extractive nature of these relationships in terms of information and insights, and is the resourcing appropriate? And I think that's the conversation that, or a question and a challenge that really has been coming up throughout the research as well. But I would argue that there's a little bit of an opportunity there too. And I think that this is a part of the theory of change that we have in terms of developing the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion, is actually to shift away and out of this idea that we are, depending on the companies to give us money to work with them, and rather to kind of shift out of this funding relationship to one of engagement. And, I think that is the strength of the peace building field, which is just to say, like, that type of engagement and that trust building that we were referring to earlier is really where our strong suit is. And I think, if we lean into kind of who we are and what our values are in terms of how to engage in these relationships, we can hopefully continue. And also then maybe with the added component of sort of speaking the language and learning more about, the work that they're doing and how to understand it and really where to plug in, that we can maybe form these kind of meaningful partnerships and collaborations. So that's at least the theory of change at this point. And, it's going to be, I think, a long-term engagement, not something that is going to have kind of a quick fix or shift. The other thing I would highlight in terms of the funding, I do think that there are some funders out there in terms of like startup investment that are seeking to support new initiatives that have some of this baked in and built in. But the startup funding space is also just ruthless and known for disproportionate kind of allocation of funding in terms of women and minorities. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that space as well. But the kind of bright spot I was going to point to, as well as somebody who is engaging with us on the council, his name is Colin Rule, and he used to work at eBay and also has been a longtime mediator and thought about different ways to use platforms and technologies to facilitate mediation. And he's done this with eBay in the form of dispute resolution that has to do with if you buy something on their platform and it comes to you and it's not what you thought it was going to be or what you wanted it to be, how do they actually automate the process of that dispute resolution in order to resolve it without having to use humans in order to kind of scale that process? So it's using principles and processes from the mediation world in a commercial environment. But one of the things that I think is so interesting that Colin is able to do and talk about with great conviction is actually the value proposition of online spaces that are socially cohesive. One of the things he talks about from his experience at eBay is that that people don't want to use platforms and products that are have this really negative or hostile or kind of negative conflict sort of cloud hanging over them. And so this is sort of part of the argument and the justification that he brings and also makes in terms of the social media companies and where they ought to go, that people are going to start falling out of these spaces if it's really just kind of a toxic environment. And so while it's not a direct kind of answer to where should the funding come from for these kind of peace tech initiatives, I do think it is still kind of a financial argument for the kinds of products and platforms that we're hoping to build. So I hope that kind of helps. And thanks, Melissa, for the question. I think we have another question here from Katayine. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. So she says, I have a question. Facebook CTO made a comment that this issue of hate speech is one of demand, where these companies find profits because of the societal demand of such speech. Along with coming with tech-oriented solutions, what can the peace building community do in general to facilitate resilience by alleviating hatred at a societal level? I love this question, Yine, sorry again if I'm pronouncing it wrong. I love this question because of all the time I spent working on hate speech, one of the things that I constantly kind of brought up was that all this focus on the speech and the language itself and the content moderation is kind of ignoring the root cause, which is another thing that the peace building field really kind of brings to this conversation. What is the root cause of this hate speech? And those are really the drivers of conflict and the narratives. And so, yes, hate speech is sort of like a symptom of the problem. So I think this is just a great question. I'm going to open it up to Lisa and David to see what thoughts you have. I think, David, obviously the social dilemma talks about this as well. It's, the concept of kind of profiting off of hate speech. And so, yeah, I wonder what thoughts you have and what perspective you would bring to this question.
I can go first. And I think, first of all, I would completely agree around a need for deeper complementary work between what's happening in the tech sector and the work that is happening that isn't necessarily cited in technology to address hate. I come from, in addition to a software development background, I come from a community organizing background. And I often in this work think about both the technology of broadcast and amplification, which is most of what social media is built around, which is where interventions like moderation make the most sense, and technology of organizing, which I take a great deal of inspiration from the peace building sector about, which is, among other things, about how people come together in groups and how to structure that in ways that create fundamentally different outcomes. And I'm really inspired by the work of Project Moonshot CVE around this. So they are a group that works in close coordination with Life After Hate, a group of former members of hate groups. And one of their core interventions is that they will take out ads that target people who are in hate groups that are just about things like how to manage anger. They're just about feelings of isolation, because often people in these groups are there because they're deeply struggling with their own emotional landscape. And often once they're in those groups, because many other people don't want to talk to them, they feel really isolated. They feel like they can't get out because the only friends they'll ever have are caught in these groups. And so they're really about providing safe pathways for those people to understand themselves. And then if they feel inspired to exit, having a path for them to exit. And so those kind of interventions that happen at that level of kind of organizing and facilitation feel deeply underexplored, and like there are some very strong ways to move practices from the peace building sector into them. I don't think that they're a silver bullet by any means, but they're a place where I'd love to see more innovation happening.
That's wonderful, David. Thanks for mentioning Moonshot. I think we're all fans of their work, and it really does kind of highlight where is this demand coming from, right? Because it's not that there's some kind of inevitable demand for hate and for this kind of negative manifestation of conflict, rather that there are like needs that are not being met for certain communities that do need to be addressed. And this is something that, is not just something that the peace building sector is working on. It's, it is a multi-sector sort of approach, government programming, peace building, community organizing. There's so many different kind of pieces to that puzzle that need to be kind of working hopefully in tandem to provide these pathways, and the work that Moonshot's doing is excellent. Lisa, I wonder if you have another perspective on the question that you want to offer.
Yeah, let me add to what you all are saying. So Moonshot CVE uses the redirect method, so if somebody's searching for an extremist term, they get redirected, and they often get a number of different options. And one of the fascinating things about Moonshot CVE is they've been able to judge which of the links that they're redirected to are they most likely to click on. And the most likely is basically social work, digital social work of, are you feeling a loss of meaning? Are you feeling lonely? Do you want to talk to a counselor? And, it's not a huge proportion that click anything on the redirect method, but the highest clicks go to, I'm lonely. I'm lacking meaning. I want a sense of belonging, which gets to the broader issue of all this new technology is coming online just as we have these existential crises of the climate crisis, of mass migration, so many people on the planet uprooted from their home communities and their traditions, and then you have this weaponizable technology added on top of that, and then a pandemic that makes everybody really lonely. And what you get from those existential crises is mass digital radicalization with a tool like Facebook that is asking you to declare your allegiance, your identity. I mean, that's what we know from conflict theory, is that all of us have a need for identity. Mm-hmm. And throughout history, there's been this us versus them dynamic, and it's been really hard for people to form identities that are not antagonistic to another group, that are positive identities, that, my identity is not against your identity. It's just defining yourself without being against something else. So, some of that historic literature from political science on in groups and out groups and us versus them. I mean, Facebook just lights that all on fire and asks people to, share information in a sense that will make them feel belonging, often in a very extremist group. But I think this really leads us to seeing, again, this huge opportunity for peace building to speak into those needs for identity and belonging. And, I teach a course here also on violent extremism, and it's so easy to demonize people from a peace building perspective who belong to violent extremism until you realize they're very lonely people who feel lost. And the approach that we should take with them is probably different than just a law enforcement approach, although that is necessary to prevent violence from happening in the short term. But if we're actually thinking about how do we prevent violence here in the United States, where, the neighbors have their guns out and the Confederate flags, and our bumper stickers take to the ditches. We are in a dangerous situation here in the United States with militia groups, and all that great work that I saw my Afghan colleagues doing, reaching out to the Taliban for the last several decades. That's what I'm trying to figure out. How do we replicate that sort of innovation in kind of reaching out to people who hold extremist groups? And it has a lot to do with belonging and frustration that the world is changing and the governments are not able to keep up with things. And there's just a sense of mass chaos. So, yeah.
Thanks for bringing that example, Lisa, too, because I think, this is something that we do hear often as well, especially from folks at the tech company, that, this is not necessarily a tech problem. This is a human problem and a social problem. And I think, very much it's a both and in terms of how we understand the ways in which, how complex it really is to address human and social problems, which we completely kind of have, we have that experience in the peace building field and in the community organizing space. And of course, we can now understand that tech can actually amplify and facilitate some of those social and human problems. And what would it look like to really kind of amplify and solve for the more of the social cohesion. So I just think that brings us back to this idea that actually we can use these tools for so many different purposes and different ends. We have another question from someone who's here today, Ted Perlmutter. Thanks for the question. I'll read it out loud and we'll do a round of answers. Is there any effort to integrate the human rights field and discourse with the peace building? I teach in both fields, so I know that this is not an easy question. I mention this since I just heard that the Facebook Oversight Board is explicitly drawing on the global impact. Love this question, Ted. Definitely, as somebody who also came from movement building spaces into the peace building field, I also have struggled at, the sort of unnecessary kind of delineations between human rights and nonviolent movements and organizing and the peace building field. To me, they're sort of all under the same umbrella, but I've come to understand that they are delineated by others. I think I might just get us started a little bit. I think, I sometimes used to joke that it took the tech companies a while to find the human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, right? Because there are frameworks out there that do help us kind of understand and frame some of these really extreme kind of examples. And, I think hate speech is where I was coming from that kind of point of view of, well, no, it isn't something that is not definable. It's just that, we have frameworks for sort of trying to understand and delineate between speech that really drives problematic dehumanization and conflict that can reach even levels of genocide, and this concept of free speech. So I am not personally involved in efforts, I would say, to kind of integrate the human rights and peace building discourse and field. But I would say that being fluent in human rights discourse is something that's really important for peace builders as we engage with the tech sector because of their adoption of human rights principles and the Declaration of Human Rights and as you're giving this example in terms of the global impact as well. And, we are in touch with Marissa Simmons, who's the director of human rights at Facebook, who has been doing absolutely fantastic work at Facebook over the last few years. Really the level of impact in terms of translating human rights principles into measurable and definable and, data-driven kind of metrics and indicators for the company is absolutely amazing. She's really trying to plug that we actually check out the work that they're doing there as well. So we hope to amplify some of that through the report that we're writing. But I really do think that actually the human rights framework is the one that has been most widely adopted by tech and social media companies as something that we should absolutely be able to speak to and relate to and connect with in terms of the language that we use in the peace building field. Lisa, I wonder if you have other perspectives on this. I know this is probably a conversation that you've been a part of for many years as well in the peace building field in terms of the delineations and actually when these fields used to actually be the same field. I think you have some interesting stories about this too. But what does it look like in terms of tech and social cohesion today?
Well, I think, traditionally the conversation between the human rights field and the peace building field goes something like this. And I can hear Shamal Idris, head of Search for Common Ground, saying these words that, the human rights community tends to rely on shaming, blaming, advocacy when it comes to human rights, because, shaming and naming is an important dynamic. So the way the human rights community is dealing with the tech companies is actually through sort of, all the papers they have written about the human rights abuses that are being fomented through these platforms. And so what I'm sort of coming at this question in the terms of the peace building community is coming to this saying, we recognize that those harms are happening on the tech platforms. We're not in denial about that, but the peace building community's way of dealing with governments and with a lot of harmful actors, doing other kinds of harm around the world is to figure out, is there some common ground? So this whole Council on Social social cohesion and technology is really is taking a different approach to the tech companies also than the human rights community. So we have different thematic issues, different indicators when we start measuring things. I think all of us completely embrace a human rights ethic and approach. There's no question that that's our value system. The way we're thinking about our theory of change is a bit different.
And I would just add to that framing, Lisa, that in our experience, the Center of Humane Technology, we're often both trying to create external pressure in the way that sort of human rights advocacy does, and respond to and serve the people who are distressed by that pressure to help them move in a different direction. And I think understanding how those two tasks are deeply complementary and much more effective when they're coordinated, when we've been able to say, hey, there's external pressure, but we also know there's an internal group of employees that are trying to push something through. And if those two things can align, they'll be much, much more effective, is an interesting meeting point of those threads in this conversation.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we have a few more minutes. If there's any more questions, please either raise your hand or drop it into the chat now. But I just want to take a moment to thank both of you for joining today on the panel, David and Lisa. It's been such a joy working with both of you over the last several months. And, it's been great just chatting with you today through this panel as well. And thanks for everyone who joined as well to join us for this session. It's been wonderful just hearing your questions and for the engagement in the chat. We're looking forward to continuing this work. Please do reach out to us through the channels that you can if you're interested in learning more about the work that we're doing. If you have examples to share about successful engagements in terms of cross-sector partnerships or collaborations. We're interested in hearing from you about your examples and also about your ideas for the role that the peacebuilding community can play in this work. So thanks again for joining. I think we'll maybe close out just a few minutes early today, and thank you all for your time.
If you have questions and want to stay on, we're happy to talk informally too.
Yeah.
If we can figure out how to get your microphone on. I think all of us are struggling with this platform a bit. Some nice comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Althea, for being the organizer, moderator, facilitator.
Absolutely. And Ted, if you'd like to stay around, I'm happy to put you on live. Let me see if I can get you.
I tried to figure that out and oh yeah, there he is. You're live, Will. Oh, but maybe he can't talk.
I think you're on mute, but if you unmute yourself, let me see if I can. Hey, good to see you. You're still on mute. Let me see if I can unmute you.
There we go. Sorry, I don't know how I was able to access. I was trying to get on before, so all of a sudden I'm on. But anyway, thank you. It was a really rich discussion, and yeah, the only other thought I had was just hearing more, and maybe your next session, your next outreach about just kind of how to scale up that financing for these alternative ways, these alternative technologies that sound so promising. And frankly, you're much more involved in this sector, particularly David. It would seem that there's that level of innovation, that degree of innovation would have commercial backing and support. It would seem to me. So anyway. I think there's a real hunger for it amongst people. So this was a very rich discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for joining, Will.
Well, my response to that is just in some of the interviews we've had with people who left the big tech companies and maybe got in early and have huge stock options now, there is an interest among this new group of millionaires to try to figure out what's next. And part of my hope is that the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion will sort of raise the profile of peace tech and digital peace building so that more people kind of give it some validity, it's seen, and that maybe we can find some investors. We do know that Craig Newmark from Craigslist and Omidyar Network. There's actually already big tech geniuses who have invested quite heavily in peace building. So we just need a bit more.
Yeah, and it needs a profile too. I think the more people learn about that, I think they'd be inspired by it. And,
Melissa Clark would like. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Alicia.
I was just going to say Melissa Clark has a question or wants to talk
Yes.
to you. If somebody can unmute her, I'm not able to. Go ahead, David.
I tried to add her too. I couldn't. Elias, I'm not sure if you're able to.
David.
If we're while we're seeing if someone else, I was just going to add on top of that so much of the way that funding operates is kind of hype based. It's about a story of speculative value, and there's a strange witchcraft by which those stories are created and popularized that often is not necessarily that grounded in reality. And so I think thinking about what is the story about why peace building matters, why peace building is a part of the innovation that we need to shape the future, and who do we bring, who are some of the first people who get brought along, who want to prove that's the case. And I think to your point earlier, Althea and Lisa, like thinking about those as mainstream Silicon Valley VCs may not be the right move. That there are plenty of other places where tech innovation is happening, getting funded, that are cultures that are much more amenable to the work of peace building. But thinking about where we're inviting that money into the conversation is a really important part of this discussion.
Nice.
Melissa, I think if you raise your hand again, and I think, Elias, if you're able to put her on live, we can hear from you directly, Melissa. 1 second.
Zoom has problems, but this platform.
Yes, we even did a tech run, but we're still a little bit.
David, thanks for that last point. Really well said. Thank you. Thanks again, all.
All right, Melissa, I'm sorry that we were not able to bring you in. Please do feel free to reach out to us. You can find me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat with you, connect if you want to talk about this intersection. I know Lisa shared her email as well. Sorry about that. And thanks everyone for joining. And thanks, David. Thanks, Lisa. It's been a joy. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you offline.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all so much.
Ciao.